Okay, it's 11 a.m. Welcome everyone. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wassalatu wassalamu ala ashrafil anbiya'i wal mursalin. Sayyidina wa habibina Muhammad, al-Nabi al-Ummi wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are on the globe. I know it's morning time where Dr. Mahmoud is, and it's already evening time where I am here in the UAE. I would like first to acknowledge this blessed day, the 12th of Rabi' al-Awwal, the birth of the greatest human being who ever walked on earth. Peace be upon him. I really invite all of you to celebrate this great mercy that was given to all creations, Muslims and non-Muslims, in any way possible and available to you. I know my family and I are going to attend the celebration in remembrance of the Prophet's birth after this webinar, inshallah, at Muhammad bin Rashid Library in Dubai. And in this happy day, we are also gathered to enjoy a lively presentation by Dr. Mahmoud Hasan about his paper, Discovering Charles Dickens, reading Oliver Twist through the lens of Islam. In this paper, Dr. Hasan argued that whether or not we can judge a literary text to be Islamic based on its content, not necessarily on the religious identity of its author. And if such, we can characterize Victorian novelists with writings that align with the Islamic theory of literature as Islamic. And as a case study, Dr. Hasan will talk to us about his analysis and examination of one of Charles Dickens' novels, Oliver Twist, that promoted social reform and justice to safeguard the rights of the poor and the orphan. And in doing so, Dr. Hasan is really embarking on a great mission to read and benefit from Western English literature by using an Islamic worldview that can help us Muslims bridge the gap between English literature and contemporary issues in the 21st century societies. So we have here Dr. Mahmoud Hasan with the Department of English Language. He's a professor at the Department of English Language and Literature at International Islamic University, Malaysia, IIUM. Since he completed a PhD in comparative literature at the University of Portsmouth, he has taught at the University of Dhaka for 3 years. And IIUM for 13 years, mashallah, in addition to doing a postdoctoral stint at the University of Heidelberg in Germany. He has presented papers at conferences held in the US, UK, Australia, Japan, Canada, among other countries, mashallah. Dr. Hasan has published extensively in the fields of post-colonial, Islamic, South Asian, and Muslim diasporic literature, as well as Islamic and English studies with presses such as the Asiatic Society of Bangladesh, Brill, Georgia Southern University, IIIT, where I met Dr. Hasan, Orient Black Swan, and among other publishers as well. He also guest edited a book titled Special Focus, Bangladeshi Literature in the English with Muhammad Qayyum, and that book was published in 2022. In addition to teaching, research, and supervision experiences, Dr. Hasan has developed academic and research skills through editorial involvement in journals and research projects. He edited a journal of the Asiatic Society of Bangladesh, specifically about humanities, and currently it is Asiatic at IIUM Journal of English Language and Literature. Dr. Hasan received pre-university education under Bangladesh Madrasa Education Board, where the curriculum included courses in Arabic and Islamic studies, along with more general subjects. And this background has proven immensely useful in his pursuit of looking at English literacy text from an Islamic perspective. Dr. Hasan is the author of Islamic Perspectives on 20th Century English Literature, and the current paper is part of his ongoing research on Islamic perspectives on Victorian English literature. Before I open the floor to Dr. Mahmoud's presentation, I want to share just quick housekeeping items. So the presentation will last for 30 minutes, and then we will have a Q&A session. So please do post your questions in the Q&A section. And then we will end, inshallah, promptly at 12 p.m. Eastern Time. Okay, Dr. Mahmoud, without further ado, please.
Okay, thank you. Let me just open my slides and then I will carry on, inshallah.
Okay, inshallah.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. Thank you, Dr. Bushra, for this introduction. And before I take you through this presentation, I just want to say a big thank you to IIIT, that I feel really, really honored that IIIT has considered organizing this webinar so that I can share some of my understanding and some of my experience, research experience with the audience. Special thanks go to Sister Saulat for coordinating, for his teaching through this webinar. Right from the beginning of planning up until now, she has been working very tirelessly and communicating with me to make this happen. Thank you so much. And I'm grateful to those who are attending this seminar, this webinar online, and many who will be listening to the recordings later. Before I start discussing the topic today, I just want to say a few words about the feasibility and urgency of looking at English literature from Islamic perspectives. I need to convince people, especially those who belong to my discipline, English literature, that there is a strong case of looking at English literature from Islamic perspective. Even though some people may believe that English literature and Islam are mutually exclusive, many people may believe that religion or Islam is irrelevant to English literature, and vice versa. Victorian literature is not my primary area of research interest. That's why I need to make it clear that I'm not an expert in Victorian literature, but I have undertaken this project just to let the audience know that there is a way to interpret English literary texts from Islamic perspectives. And in this case, in today's case, I will try to bring myself down to the level of undergraduate students. I will try to imagine how I would want to look at Oliver Twist, in this case, as an undergraduate student, as a Muslim undergraduate student. And I also need to make it clear that this is a huge project that I've been working on for weeks and months. So what I am going to share may not satisfy all the, or may not meet all the issues that I want to cover, but I will just try to do whatever I can in these 30 or so minutes. And I want to thank at BIIT, Bangladesh Institute of Islamic Thought, for sponsoring this project. This is part, what I am presenting today is part of a research project funded by Bangladesh Institute of Islamic Thought. So I thank BIIT, especially its executive director, Dr. Abdul Aziz, for considering this project. Now, this is a question that I am not asking for any answers. It's just a rhetorical question. Is Charles Dickens Islamic? I pose this question for rhetorical purposes. I don't seek or want to give any answer. I just want to say something else in relation to this. Our Prophet Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam had huge interest in literature. When he traveled, he used to ask his companions to recite poetry. And during the Battle of Trans, he actually composed some verses. And I know two lines. It says, Allahumma la aisha illa aisha al-akhirah fansuril ansara wal muhajira. So this is what our Prophet composed and during the Battle of Trans. And once our Prophet was traveling, and then he asked one companion to recite some verses. And that companion recited verses from Abdullah Umayyah bin Abu Salt. Umayyah bin Abu Salt. Umayyah bin Abu Salt was a poet of pre-Islamic Arabia. So he recited some verses from Umayyah bin Abu Salt. Then our Prophet Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, after listening to those lines from Umayyah bin Abu Salt, he said, Umayyah bin Abu Salt was about to become a Muslim in his poetry, or he was almost a Muslim in his poetry. That is to say that to become an Islamic writer, one does not need to be a Muslim. If the content is Islamic, then a writer is Islamic. Obviously, no human being can be 100% Islamic. There will always be some shortcomings and some lapses here and there. But my argument is that our Prophet Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam had huge respect for writers, for poets who are not Muslim. And we have another poet, Labid, and our Prophet used to like Labid's poetry. And Labid composed most or all his poetry before he embraced Islam. So our Prophet once said that the truest words spoken by a poet were the words of Labid, who said, "Lo, everything apart from God is vain and perishable." So these two instances prove that our Prophet Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam had respect for poets or writers who were not Muslim. And Labid obviously later embraced Islam, but Umayyah bin Abu Salt, I believe, passed away before Islam. So this is just an example to say that it's discussing non-Muslim writers, discussing non-Muslim poets or novelists is in line with Islam, and we can always learn from their writings. And Mahmudul was a great writer of the 20th century, and he obviously later embraced Islam in 1917. And he also argues that in order for a writer to be Islamic, that person does not need to be born in a Muslim society or in a particular period. I believe by particular period, he refers to the period of Prophet Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. So what is needed for a writer to become Islamic is that that writer should promote human progress. And human progress is a very comprehensive term, and it includes justice, egalitarianism, development, everything. And Mahmudul also believed that in Islam, there are no such terms as secular and religious. For true religion includes the whole sphere of man's activities. So that's why even if many people regard English literature as a secular project, as a secular subject, but I find many scope, or I find there is huge room for including Islamic perspectives in the study of English literature. And Dickens is also interesting for another reason. Like recently, not recently, last year, I published one major research. It's called African and Islamic. And I discussed Doris Lessing's literary theory. And there I also discuss Charles Dickens, because Charles Dickens was a committed writer, and he used literature to promote social justice, human progress. So, and Doris Lessing, in her essay, The Small Personal Voice, she also regards Charles Dickens highly because of his urge for social justice. Doris Lessing says, I see no reason why good writers should not, if they have the bent that way, write angry protest novels about economic injustice. Many good writers have. Dickens, for instance, was inspired by poverty and injustice. So in this article, I also agree with Doris Lessing, and I believe that Charles Dickens' writings has huge, his project of establishing justice in society is in line with the Islamic concept of literature. Now, as I said earlier, that I need to establish the urgency and the feasibility of looking at English literature from Islamic perspective. So there is a huge debate encircling or surrounding the discipline of English literature. Many people now believe that English literature was introduced in non-Western societies as a colonial project to spread colonialism. And Doris Lessing had the same view, that she also believed that literature, history, and philosophy, these are fully loaded with Western values and Western ideas. Doris Lessing was a high school dropout, and she stopped going to school at the age of 14. In 1982, she was interviewed, and the person who interviewed her asked her a question, whether she lamented, whether she regretted that she didn't go to a university. And then her answer was, but I am glad that I was not educated in literature and history and philosophy, which means that I did not have this Eurocentered thing driven into me, which I think is the single biggest hang-up Europe has got. It's almost impossible for anyone in the West not to see the West as the God-given gift to the world. So that is to say that Doris Lessing believed that subjects like literature is Eurocentric and is loaded with European values and ideas. And Edward Said regards imperialism as an educational movement. So Edward Said also believed that imperialism and colonialism was promoted through education, and English literature was part of that education movement. And we have John MacLeod. He said the teaching of English literature in the colonies must be understood as part of the many ways in which Western colonial powers, such as Britain, asserted their cultural and moral superiority, while at the same time devaluing indigenous cultural products. So MacLeod believed that English literature is used still now to promote Western ideas and to establish the moral and cultural superiority of the West. And I read this book some time ago. It's written by Mary Batiste. She is an indigenous Canadian scholar, and she went to a university and she studied English literature. And she argues that English literature does not mirror or reflect socio-cultural realities of indigenous settings. So in her case, it was indigenous Canadian culture. In my case, it is Bangladeshi culture. In someone else's case, it is Pakistani culture, or someone else's case, it is Arab culture. What she argues is that the English literary texts does not mirror or reflect our cultural realities from which we come or to which we belong. And that's why she says that when a student goes to the English literature class, they experience a fragmented existence. They find one existence in society and another existence in the English literature class. And then this writer from Zimbabwe, he says, when are African feet ever going to divorce European shoes? We are African, we are Asian, we are Arab, we are Indian or Bangladeshi, but we use European shoes. By European shoes, he means education, Western education. So all these things are discussed, many other similar things are discussed in this book, Doing English, A Guide for Literature Students by Robert Eagleston. This is a fascinating book and I recommend the students of English literature to read it. Eagleston discusses how English literature was used actually as a colonial tool and how it was introduced in India long before it was done so in Britain, only to promote imperial projects. Now, this is why the subject was introduced. Many of us know this statement from Thomas Babington Macaulay. He said the subject was introduced to produce a class of persons, Indian in blood and color, but English in taste, in opinions, in morals, and intellect. So this is known case. Now, because of all this debate, now there is some kind of resistance to English literature. Ngugi wa Thiong'o, he wrote an article in 1972. The title is On the Abolition of English of the English Department. So the title itself is obvious that he does not like or he does not want English literature to be taught in non-British or non-Western countries as a Western project, but obviously, even if it needs to be taught, it has to be taught from African, from Asian, from other perspectives. And Gauri Vishwanathan argues almost the same in her book, Mask of Conquest. And Edward Said in Culture and Imperialism, he talks about especially the novel genre, how this was used to promote Western culture, to promote colonial culture. And this man, an academic, I think he's an Argentine academic, now teaches at Duke University, and he talks about epistemic disobedience, independent thought, and decolonial freedom. And again, a kind of resistance to Western education. And recently I came across this article, Decolonizing English Literature Departments at Arab Countries. And then recently, early this year, there was an article in the New Yorker. The title is The End of the English Major. So all these titles suggest that there is a huge debate whether English literature will continue to be taught even in Western countries, even in Western societies. And politically, Jyoti Basu was the longest serving chief minister of West Bengal. West Bengal is part of India. And he launched a movement against English literature, even though personally he sent his children to learn English to other countries, but politically he was opposed to English literature. So why I am narrating all these resistance? I'm trying to make an argument. The argument is that there is some kind of misgivings or ideological opposition to English literature. So it was first introduced in British India so that the Indians become supportive of the colonial project, supportive of the East India Company. And we see a kind of disconnect between English literature and the students from other cultures who study the subject. So this is real. Now, what I understand is that when there is a movement to decolonize education, there is a movement to indigenize education, a movement to decolonize English literature, or to indigenize English literature. So the best way for in Muslim country to do it is to look at the subject from Islamic perspectives. And that has some kind of salvific value. I borrow this phrase salvific from Ismail Razi al-Faruqi. He uses this term in regards to the English language, but I can also say this, I mean, in relation to English literature. What I argue is that if we look at English literature from Islamic perspectives, we establish some kind of relevance of the subject to Muslim societies. And that will give a greater relevance to the subject, that will give a greater connection between the subject and the learners. So this is how we can use Islamic perspectives on English literature to make the subject relevant, to Muslim students, to Muslim societies. And this is part of decolonization or indigenization of Western education. So while in non-Muslim societies, non-Western, non-Muslim societies, people will use their own religious or cultural perspectives while decolonizing or indigenizing English literature. I argue in Muslim societies, the best way to decolonize and indigenize English literature is to look at the subject from Islamic perspective. And I am discussing Charles Dickens today as part of this project, that we can look at Charles Dickens from Islamic perspectives. And when we do so, Charles Dickens will be more relevant to Muslim societies, and students will not feel that there is a kind of fragmented existence or there is a kind of disconnect between them and the subject they are reading. And when we look at any writer from Islamic perspectives, we need to remember this particular statement from Sayyid Ali Ashraf. Sayyid Ali Ashraf wrote this article in 1978, and IIIT was established in 1981. So 3 years before IIIT was established, Ali Ashraf's paper was published, and he says in that paper, no human activity is entirely good or entirely bad, because only God is absolutely good and Shaitan is absolutely bad. That means when we look at a particular writer and their works, we need to bear in mind that there will be issues or there will be arguments in their writing which are in compliance with Islam. There will be other things which may not be in compliance with Islam or in agreement with Islam. So we need to bear this in mind, that we are looking at human knowledge. We are not looking at revealed or divine knowledge. So since human knowledge is imperfect, so there will be always issues when we look at them from Islamic perspective. Now, when I asked the rhetorical question at the beginning, whether Charles Dickens is an Islamic writer or not, and I also argued that his concept of literature and Islamic concept of literature go very well, because he was a committed writer, and Islam also promotes committed literature. That means Islam promotes literature for human development, not literature for the sake of literature or art for art's sake. While I look at many similarities between Charles Dickens' ideas, especially in Oliver Twist, and Islam, I also want to make it clear that there are issues with Charles Dickens which are not very Islamic and which are not very just. For example, there is a strong allegation of anti-Semitism in his writing, especially in Oliver Twist, the way he portrays Fagin, and he uses the term Jew again and again in the book. So this is one issue in his writing. And Eliza Davis was his contemporary, and she is famous for her correspondence with Charles Dickens. And she says that the portrayal of Fagin did a great wrong to all Jews. And she also says that it has been said that Charles Dickens, the large-hearted, whose works plead so eloquently and so nobly for the oppressed of his country, and who may justly claim credit at the fruits of his labor, the many changes for the amelioration of the condition of the poor at work, he encouraged a vile prejudice against the despised Hebrew. So this allegation is there against Charles Dickens, and Charles Dickens was aware of this allegation during his when he was writing this novel. That's why up until chapter 38, he uses the term Jew again and again. But after chapter 38, Charles Dickens decreased the mention of Jew in his in this novel. And we can also use Charles Dickens' Oliver Twist to make an argument against media caricaturing or against media misrepresentation of Muslims. In Oliver Twist, Charles Dickens again and again characterizes Fagin as the Jew. And obviously, Fagin was a child catcher. He was a fence. He used to train robbers, and he used to exploit young boys and girls for his own benefits. So obviously, he's an evil character, but there are other evil characters in the novel. But Charles Dickens does not characterize them as Christians. The other characters are obviously Christian, but Charles Dickens does not mention their religion. So in today's world, we can see a relevance of this when media represents Muslims. When a crime is committed by Muslims, their religion is also put on trial. But when a similar crime is committed by non-Muslims, their religion is not brought to the front. So we can also say that anti-Semitism is there in Oliver Twist, and in the same way, Muslims also suffer from media caricaturing or misrepresentation when their religion is always mentioned when one member of the Muslim community commits a crime. Similarly, Charles Dickens uses Fagin's religion again and again, and this is a serious charge against him. And actually, Charles Dickens later realized that he did something wrong. Then perhaps because of that, later he wrote another book, Our Mutual Friend. And in that book, he portrays a Jewish character, Mr. Ria, and he portrays Mr. Ria as a very gentle human being. And there is a Christian character in the book, Mr. Fredgeby, and that person is cruel. So he perhaps realized that he did some kind of disservice to the Jewish community by portraying Fagin and mentioning his religion again and again in the book. And then later he composed Our Mutual Friend as a kind of compensation. Now, another charge against Charles Dickens is colonialism. He was completely quiet or largely quiet about British colonialism in other countries. I recently read this article by Alex Stigall. Alex Stigall is one of my PhD supervisors, and he wrote this short article, but it's quite revealing how Charles Dickens had problems with the issue of colonialism. So even though Charles Dickens is not known as a colonial writer, but there are issues in his attitude to colonialism and how he sometimes even defended colonial enterprises in other countries. And his younger son, Walter, was packed off to India as sorry, his Okay, so his younger son was packed off to India, and his other two sons went to Australia. And at that time, we know that India and Australia were British colonies. And his opinion about non-Western people was also not very good, because in 1883, there was some kind of Zulu exhibition in London. And then Charles Dickens wrote this essay, The Noble Savage, and his portrayal of African people was not very flattering, was not very positive in this essay. And when in India, the Great Rebellion happened in 1857, Charles Dickens supported the British retribution, or the disproportionate British response of killing and massacring people in India. So he supported that. So that is another indication that he was not opposed to British colonialism. And in Oliver Twist, he mentions West Indies 3 times. And it is known that at that time, West Indies was a site of the slave trade. But his mention of West Indies does not say anything about the evil of the slave trade. So then again, we can say that he was a bit complicit with the slave trade. And then the abolition movement in Britain was happening during his lifetime. And we see in 1807, the slave trade ended. And then in 1833, the slavery completely ended in British territories, even though in America it continued until 1865, I think. But in all cases, Charles Dickens was quiet. He did not have an opinion, or he did not oppose the slave trade that was happening in British territories. And his treatment of his wife, Catherine, was also not very good. At one time, he wanted to ban the law to place his wife in a lunatic asylum. And now there are writings have been published which discuss his treatment of his wife. And things got really sour when he met this actress, Ellen Turner, in 1857, after he established a relationship with this woman. The next year, in 1858, he divorced his wife. So there are also a problem in his treatment of his wife. But when I say that there are ideas in Charles Dickens' writing which are in agreement with Islam, I look at Charles Dickens' writing from a British perspective, in the sense that he wanted to establish social justice in Britain through his writing. And he is known as the novelist of the poor, or committed, and he is a committed writer in the sense that he tried his best to end oppression of the poor and oppression of the orphan in his country, especially through writing Oliver Twist. Dr. Bushra, how much time do I have?
Where like I gave you more than 30 minutes, Dr. Mahmoud. I just want to give some time to Q&A. I have only 3 questions. So maybe through a couple of minutes so you can wrap up. It should be fine.
Sorry, when I saw you, I understood that this is a sign that I, okay, anyway, so what I want to argue is that Charles Dickens fought for social justice in Britain. And justice is the core of Islam. In the Quran, Allah says, "Qul amarani Rabbi bil qist." O Prophet, you say that my Lord enjoins justice. And then Allah sent all prophets in different spatio-temporal locations to establish justice. Allah says, "Liyaquma an-nasa bil qist," so that the people settle their affairs in justice. And there are warnings against injustices in the Quran and in Hadith. But one thing that I must highlight here, I want to highlight two things before I conclude. Number one is illegitimate, Oliver Twist as an illegitimate child, an orphan. He is an illegitimate child in the sense that his mother and his father was not married, and it's mentioned in chapter 1 in the book and again in chapter 51 that he was an illegitimate child. But we need to also understand what is Islam's approach to illegitimate child. Now, in some societies, children born outside of marriage are called harami or haramzada or bastard. Is it Islamic? Is it okay to discriminate against children born outside of wedlock or if the parents are not married? No, in Islam, there is no difference in terms of human purity between a normal child and so-called illegitimate child. Because a child born outside of marriage is not his fault or her fault. If extramarital sex happens, that happens between his parents, and he has no role in that. And in Islam, there is one fundamental rule or fundamental principle. And Allah mentions this in the Quran again and again, وَلَا تَزِرُ وَازِرَةٌ وِزْرَ أُخْرَى. No human being will be responsible for the fault of another human being. So each of us will come on the day of judgment and will present ourselves in front of Allah individually. We will be responsible for our own sins, not for the sins of others. And Allah says, لَقَدْ جِئْتُمْ فُرَدَا كَمَا خَلَقْنَاكُمْ أَوَّلَ مَرَّةٍ, that each of us will come to Allah individually. So the kind of negative representation of illegitimate child that is rampant in Muslim and non-Muslim society, this is un-Islamic. We cannot discriminate or we cannot have negative impression about a child that is married, that is born outside marriage. And number two is the treatment of orphan. Oliver Twist is an orphan. His mother passed away right after his birth. When he was born, his mother said, "Let me see the child and die." And then the patient shook her head, that means the patient is his mother, shook her head and stretched out her hand towards the child. The surgeon deposited it in her arm. She imprinted her cold white lips passionately on its forehead, passed her hands over her face, gazed wildly round, shuddered, fell back, and died. She chafed her breast, hands, and temples, but the blood had stopped forever. That means she died. And this is how he was, obviously treated the rest of his life. But now that he was enveloped in that calico robes, which had grown yellow in the same service, he was badged and ticketed and fell into his place at once. Paris child, the orphan of a workhouse, the humble, self-starved drudge, to be cuffed and buffeted, that means to be mistreated throughout the world, despised by all and pitied by none. So this is the condition of an orphan in 19th century Britain. Now let us also look at our Prophet Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, how he became an orphan. So I can see no one can be compared to the Prophet, but I just want to say that our Prophet was also an orphan, and the way he lost his father and his mother, there is some similarity. For example, Amina, when she was coming back from Medina, she died on the way. So I read a biography of Baraka, who looked after the Prophet. This is from Baraka's biography. It says, on the way back to Mecca, Amina became seriously ill with fever. Halfway between Yathrib and Mecca, at a place called Al-Abwa, they stopped. Amina's health deteriorated rapidly. One pitch dark night, she was running a high temperature. The fever had got to her head, and she called out to Baraka in a choking voice. Baraka related. She whispered in my ear, "Oh Baraka, I shall depart from this world shortly. I commend you, my son Muhammad, to your care. He lost his father while he was in my abdomen. Now here he is now, losing his mother under his own eyes. Be a mother to him, Baraka, and don't ever leave him." And then Baraka said, "My heart was shattered and I began to sob and wail. The child was distressed by my wailing and began to weep. He threw himself in his mother's arms and held tightly onto her neck. She gave one last moan and then was forever silent." So this is how our prophet became an orphan. So when I teach a text like Oliver Twist to a class, and I know that majority of my students are Muslim, I will find it very weird and very strange not to relate the question of orphanhood and how Islam looks at orphanhood and how our prophet and how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us to be kind to the orphan. And we have many, many verses in the Quran where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us to be kind to the orphan. For example, in this verse, Allah says, "Nay, nay, O man, consider all that you do and fail to do. You are not generous towards the orphan." I think the Arabic text is "Kalla balla tukrimunal yatim wala tahadduna ala ta'amil miskin." So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala admonishes us that there are many people who are ungrateful and they are not generous to the orphan. And then again in Surah Duha, Allah says, "Therefore the orphan shall not be, orphan shall thou never wrong." I think the Arabic is فَأَمَّا الْيَتِيمَ فَلَا تَقْهَرْ وَأَمَّا السَّائِلَ فَلَا تَنْهَرْ وَأَمَّا بِنِعْمَةِ رَبِّكَ فَحَدِّثْ. That we shall not oppress or wrong orphan. And our prophet said, "I am the one who cares for the orphans excellently, will be as close in paradise as those two fingers of mine." So what I want to say is that when we teach an English text like Oliver Twist to Muslim audience, to Muslim students, it is very important that we bring in Islamic perspectives and we relate it to the Muslim experience so that English literature does not remain something from another country and does not remain foreign to the students, so that the students can relate themselves to what they learn in the English literature class. So I believe my time is up. I'm sorry that initially I was too ambitious to foreground my discussion. I took a longer, but I had many other things to discuss today. I believe, inshallah, when the article is published, it will more fulfilling for me, because in my writing I can discuss it more. But I just want to say a final word that there is a huge potential, or there is plenty of wind in the sail of looking at English literature from Islamic perspectives. And we need great scholars. We need very smart people to promote this. And if we can look at English literature from Islamic perspectives, it is a win-win situation. Both English literature and Islam will be benefited, or both English literature and Islam will promote each other if we can look at English literature from Islamic perspectives. With this, I thank you all for attending, and those who will be listening to the recording. I am very privileged to have spoken in front of you, and thank you very much for the privilege of your time. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Alaikum salam wa rahmatullah. Thank you so much, Dr. Mahmoud, for this interesting discussion. We have several questions, actually. So the first one from Muhammad, Omar. So he says, art for art is a Western concept, whereas I think that Islam promotes a more utilitarian concept of literature. How far is that true?
Yeah, I wrote a long article on this topic. It says good literature and bad literature. So I argued in my article that Islam does not support the concept of art for art's sake, because in Islam there is a principle. The principle is ilm nafi. Ilm should be beneficial. Ilm should not be a kind of disconnect from our human life. So we have two kinds of literature. One is belletristic literature, that is literature for the sake of literature or art for art's sake. And the other one is didactic literature or committed literature. Didactic literature, committed literature promotes, human progress or human development. A literature that serves good purposes, literature for the sake of human being, not literature for the sake of literature. So yes, art for art's sake is not Islamic, and I do not believe that art for art's sake is a good proposition. I promote art for the sake of human being, or art for the sake of social or human development. And I believe Islam supports literature for human being, not literature for the sake of literature.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Mahmoud. And then the second question, um, it's a kind of comment, not a question. She said, I think it's more accurate to use Islamically acceptable culture or literature rather than saying Islamic culture.
Yeah, we can debate different terms, but I think both of us agree that a culture will not be 100% Islamic, because Islam is some kind of ideal thing. We can never reach 100%. So obviously there will always be some loopholes, some pitfalls, and then some shortcomings here and there. So yeah, I think the spirit should be like, we should not equate Islam with a particular culture. So yeah, so there will be always some issues when we characterize a society or a culture or a literary tradition as Islamic, because as I said, as I mentioned, Syed Ali Ashraf's quote that human being cannot be 100% good. It's only Allah
Yeah.
subhanahu wa ta'ala is 100% good. So there will always be some issues. So I think we are on the same page.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Mahmoud. And then another question, it says, just as Daniel Defoe, I think hopefully I'm pronouncing his name correctly, read Ibn Tufayl's Hay Ibn
Yaqdan,
Yaqdan to write Robin Crusoe, and just as Dante Alighieri read
hmm.
read the letter of forgiveness to write Divine Commedia, I think that Muslims should look at Western literature in general and English literature in particular to draw comparison and similarities. I think that IIIT and IIUM should offer incentives to promote research in this sphere. What do you think?
Yeah, obviously there is. Many of us know that Islamic scholars of the past influenced many Western writers, and Daniel Defoe is a case. Like Ibn Tufail's Hayy ibn Yaqdan inspired his Robinson Crusoe. This is well known, the way Robinson Crusoe survived in an island, and how Ibn Tufail describes a similar situation is Hayy ibn Yaqdan. So obviously there are cross-cultural influences all around us. So it's not only Muslim scholars influenced Western writers. Many Western writers also influenced Muslim writers. For example, you mentioned Dante Alighieri, his Divine Comedy. He also influenced, I think Dante also influenced Muhammad Iqbal. If Ibn Tufail influenced Daniel Defoe, then Dante Alighieri influenced Muhammad Iqbal. So there are always, cross-cultural influences. So I don't want to claim monopoly on any specific issue that we Muslims influence the whole world or we inspired everything. No, there have always been back and forth influences. So And I also do
Mhm.
not believe that we can always be complacent because our early scholars were great, but we need to be great now. It's not that they will
Right.
protect us or they will represent us today.
Yes. I couldn't agree more. They did their work, and it's
Yeah.
our time to continue the great work. Thank you, Dr. Mahmoud. There's a question that says, in discussing his work, how do you navigate? Um, yeah, how do you navigate biographical material that presents personal information about Dickens that he might have considered to be impermissible backbiting?
Yeah, actually, I don't want to worry too much about their personal life. As a student of literature, my job is to look at the text. What is there in the text? And if there is some relevant information in his life which will help me interpret the text, then I will consider biographical information. But other than that, I don't want to judge the writer, but I just want to focus on his writings. And I believe Said Ali Ashraf said in one sentence volumes that we will never find any human being 100% good. And that's why I discussed all those issues of slavery, colonialism, and anti-Semitism, and his treatment of his wife. All these are issues and allegations and charges against Charles Dickens. So in a separate discussions, I can discuss those, but what I wanted to highlight in today's discussion was like his concern for the poor, his concern for the orphan, and his movement, intellectual movement to promote social justice in Britain. And this is where we can learn a lot. Interestingly, in 19th century Britain, we had the problems of orphans and the poor. Now in today's Britain, we don't have that problem. But in many Muslim societies, we have the same problem. Like we
Yeah.
will find more orphans and more child mistreatment of children in Muslim societies. In Bangladesh,
Yeah.
in Pakistan, in many other Muslim societies, where there is huge social injustice. And orphans and the children are one of the common victims of all those injustices. So I just wanted to convey a message that we can learn from Charles Dickens, Oliver Twist, and we can address the problem in our society. So if we look at Charles Dickens from a British perspective only, and as something from the 19th century, then I don't see any value, or why shall I study it? So we can
Yeah.
study it to address problems in our society, in our cultures, in our countries. And that is what I mean, like we need to make it relevant to our society, not something that is extraterrestrial.
Thank you, Dr. Mahmoud. There is a question that says, how can I find more resources on teaching literature, whether British or international, from an Islamic perspective?
I think I said toward the end of my talk that there is huge potential in this movement of looking at English literature from Islamic perspectives. And I also am not very happy with the amount of scholarship that has been done in this area. So I have been writing for more than 10 years now on Islam and English literature. So some of my writings can help, but I hope many other more and more competent scholars will address this issue. And there is a huge need to look at English literature from Islamic perspectives. I believe other scholars will come forward, especially those who are from Muslim background, and those who will make English literature more relevant to Muslim societies. So to answer your question, you can email me personally. I can give you some materials. I have my writings and writings of other scholars which address looking at English literature from Islamic perspective. So I think if you can go to my university website, my email address is there. It's mmhasan iium.edu.my.
Okay. Thank you so much. There are other questions. Sorry, but the time really is short to answer all of them. I don't know, IT, if we can have these questions in the channel, so Dr. Mahmoud can respond to them afterward. That would be great. But thank you so much. Thanks for everybody, everyone who attended this webinar. I hope it was beneficial to you. I know I've learned a lot. I really didn't think about this perspective, like reading English literature from an Islamic worldview or Islamic perspective. It was new to me. So thank you so much, Dr. Mahmoud. Appreciate your time. And have a great rest of your day, inshallah.
Thank you. Thank you. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah. Thank you, everyone. Thank you again, Triple IT, and thank you, Saulat, for your help and support.